Welcome to the Crafting Character Podcast. Steve Carter here, and in association with my good friends at Preaching Today and Food for the Hungry, I bring you a podcast that hopefully helps you get better at the crafts of teaching and preaching and communicating God's word while always hoping and ensuring our character leads the way. Well, today I'm excited to interview the one and only Ruth Haley Barton. And I have to tell you, when I showed up to Willow in 2012, there were a few names that just got dropped every once in a while. And when their names were dropped, it was like, it was a weightiness, a level of gratitude. And Ruth Haley Barton's name was one of those. I've actually never met her. I've read a majority of her books. I've had friends who have participated and gone to the retreats that her and her team lead called the Transforming Center. But she is one of the most esteemed and appreciated and just important voices around the soul and discernment. And I'm excited to just kind of talk to her about the soul of the pastor, the preacher, the teacher, and how we can actually learn the art of discernment. So without further ado, the one, the only, Ruth Haley Barton, welcome.
Thank you, Steve. That was way too gracious, but I appreciate it.
Well, I mean, it's true. That's the beautiful piece is like, there was something that I would hear about how, I don't know, just the keeping, the maintaining, the importance of the soul of the leader. Where did that begin for you? Where you started to be like fascinated and intrigued? Because even in my Bible college and my study and prep as a preacher, it was about saving souls, not maintaining my own soul. So bring me back to where you first started to discover the importance of the soul of the leader and pastor.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, that's a really long journey, but I'll try to keep it short. I mean, it began when I was in my early 30s. I'm a pastor's kid, by the way. And so that's the world I know the best. And that's the world I felt I would enter into vocationally. And so I did. And in my early 30s, I really hit a wall in terms of my own spirituality, questions that I didn't have answers for, emotions that I could manage, but not always fully understand and do anything good with. And I was driven, like really quite driven with a performance-oriented drivenness that I wouldn't have even known to name it that way then. But I was already into it by the time I was in my 30s. I was already into that performance-oriented drivenness that even pastors and spiritual leaders can have when we try to kind of make a vocation out of our Christian life, and there's an occupational hazard in there that is really important to pay attention to. So at that point, though, I was already on staff at a church that I loved and cared about, but realized that, there was something that needed to be happening inside me that wasn't happening. And I was very concerned for myself, actually, in terms of the unhealth of the way that I was living and how that was affecting me, but the people around me. And so I, at that point, started going to a spiritual director, which no one around me knew what that was then. I didn't even know what one was then. Started out with some therapy, but then I didn't realize that she was also a trained spiritual director, and she asked if we could switch the focus of our times together. And that's when we really started paying attention to the questions that I was carrying in my soul. But she said, I think you need to pay attention to these questions within the context of your relationship with God. Are you willing for us to sort of shift the focus from therapeutic fixing to spiritual direction and taking these questions up with God as a part of your spirituality? And so, that was a very profound invitation for me at the time, and led me eventually to get off the ministry leadership treadmill for a while and to take a couple of years where I just attended to my soul, because I came to the awareness that my pastor dad, and the church and God were all sort of glommed together into one thing, and I could not pull the threads out, and I couldn't do it while staying in ministry. And I realized that was the first moment where I prioritized my soul over my vocational call to ministry. And I said, what's happening here right now is so important. And I just can't keep showing up at church, doing the things that I do and being on that performance treadmill and do the work that my soul needs. And I know that's a scary thought, and I'm not recommending that for everyone, but it changed my life significantly because I did step off the ministry treadmill for a couple years. I didn't even go to church at that time.
Wow.
Just attending to my own life with God, and unraveling the threads, like pulling those threads apart and experiencing God as being different than my pastor dad, God as being different than the church and distinct from what I had experienced in church. And that was really the beginning of attending to my soul and believing that somehow, even when I wasn't even going to church, I had a spiritual director and I had a few people who knew what I was doing, and I was taking real attention with my own spiritual life, believing that I still was investing in my life in ministry, but realizing that the soul is the most important part of who I am. And that needs to be cultivated in order for me to be the person that God would have me to be. So that was the beginning, certainly not the end, but that was the beginning. Then eventually I did find my way back into leadership, and that's actually where I was on staff at Willow Creek for a while then, bringing some of those very things to the staff and the people.
That's
there.
amazing. I can't even imagine at early 30s just calling a timeout.
Yeah.
And that's
when everything's supposed to be up and to the right at that point.
Exactly. And especially like when you have that performance driven, it's like wiring, I'm a 3 on the Enneagram to achieve and just to like, hey, something's not working. When you say the soul, and I love words and I love the way people define words. When you talk about the soul, what does that mean to you?
I love that question. Well, the bottom line is that the soul of you is the part of you that is most real. Yeah. It's the part that God knew before God brought us forth in physical form, that unformed substance that the psalmist talks about, the very essence of who we are, more real than many of the things that we think are real, more real than the job or the title or even our personality. I think some people equate soul and personality, and they're not the same. Personality is just a construct. They're not the essence of who you are. It's developed in response to your external surroundings, but there's an essence of who we are, that created good that the psalmist talks about in Psalm 139, the unformed substance. And that would be an Old Testament reference, but a New Testament reference that I think is really powerful is, and then I got this from Bob Mulholland, one of my teachers. I asked him one day what the soul was, and he said, well, that's easy. That's the part of you, that's the part the place where God is present to you. So Romans, that's the place where God is present to you.
Wow.
And that we all have a soul, regardless of what our religious tradition or faith is, we all have a soul, the place where God is present to us. And straight out of Romans 8, really, that God's Spirit witnesses with our spirits about the fact that we're children of God, and then we cry out, Abba, Father. And I like to say that God's Spirit witnesses with our spirits about many things that are true. And that place where that happens is the soul.
Is the soul. Wow. And when I think about that, the to you part, the God to you, when you were going through that 2-year break, was it becoming familiar with what the soul actually is and experiencing God in a new way? What was that time of shaping and forming look like?
Well, for one thing, because I am a pastor's kid and working in the church was all I could ever see for myself. It's all I ever wanted. It was a strong sense of call, but it was, I loved the church and loved the church. I didn't know myself apart from the church.
Right.
I didn't understand who I was apart from the way I was living out vocation, within the church. And so to separate my fundamental identity from my life and vocation in the church was really, really important. And one of the best things that's happened to me, because I did come back into ministry, obviously, but I came back more in right relationship to vocational ministry then, because I knew that it's not me, my identity was separate than that, and that the whole thing could go away and I would still be me with God, But I don't think I knew that before I took that break. I don't think I had experienced me apart from, how I saw myself, within the church. And so that was a beautiful gift, to know that God is not the church and the church is not God. They're very related, but they're not the same thing, and then to know God beyond all that I had heard in the church. And for those of us who have been in ministry, we've all experienced our hurts and pains in the church too. And so to know God apart from all that, that what I had experienced in church wasn't the same thing as who God is.
Yep.
It was so very intimate. It was very, very intimate to know myself differently and to know God differently, and very private. So intimate in the sense that it was private. I wasn't living my spiritual life out in front of other people, or trying to do it in response to people outside myself. I was very much in this intimate place with God, and letting go of aspects of identity that I'd over-identified with, and knowing God apart from all of that.
Yeah, there's something. I mean, my experience was when I was 38.
Mm-hmm.
And
okay, well, that's early. That's
and
early too.
we left, Willow, and we physically moved to the desert.
Mm-hmm.
And I just would walk the trails.
Yeah.
And I knew what. If you asked me, Steve, what did you do on Wednesday mornings?
Mm-hmm.
Or on Thursday afternoon, I could tell you. I had a routine. I had a structure. And now I didn't have anything.
Mm-hmm. And
all of a sudden, that untangling, that pulling of, oh my goodness, like I really was attached to that for my identity.
Yeah.
And I really didn't know what was actually going on in my soul.
Yeah.
And there was a gift in those few years,
mm-hmm.
but there was also just this, man, I wouldn't wish this because
mm-hmm.
it was a quick detox.
Yeah.
But it was actually something that became so helpful.
Mm-hmm.
I talk to pastors often and preachers, and they can tell me the vision that they have for their church and the mission of their church.
Mm-hmm.
So it just rattles off their tongue. They know it. But what tending the soul looks like, it's like we're speaking a different language, and I feel like there's this reemergence of spiritual formation mm-hmm. that, you and others have been doing for 30 plus years.
Mm-hmm. I'm not that old, really.
But I think so much on the backs of the good work that you've done. How have you seen spiritual formation kind of like enter in spiritual direction even? Mm-hmm. And how have you seen it kind of change in this new generation and new way that feels like spiritual formation is being talked about in the church?
Mm-hmm. When I first began, and Willow was the first place I tried to bring it into a church environment, nobody knew what anything was. And it seemed like it was almost a different religion. Like, when my director invited me into Solitude and Silence, I was scared to death. I thought that she was inviting me into Buddhism or New Age philosophy or whatever. I didn't tell anybody what I was doing, because I was afraid they'd think I was falling off the path. So, that long ago, early on, you were bringing something that there was actually a lot of fear about. I mean, when I first started trying to talk about these things among Protestant Christians, there was a real fear and suspicion that this was something other than our own faith. And you had to be really, really careful with it. And I felt like we were always having to prove that it was worthy, and biblical and all of that. And so that's one of the biggest changes is now, of course, it's it's all the rage. Right. So if I can just say it's a very different thing now to have it be all the rage and everybody's almost clamoring for it. When back in the day, people were scared of it. Right. And there was the fear that it was mystical and new age and subjective, but then there was also the fear that if we paid attention to our own souls, that then we would stop caring for the needs of the world and we would be so heavenly minded, we were no earthly good. I mean, there were levels and layers of people's fear and suspicion and resistance to spiritual formation that's just not there as much now. And of course, the next generation, the younger generations, are now not even willing to settle for anything less than a true spirituality,
Yeah. Yep. I think it's so true. Mm-hmm. The Shema, love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your mind, your strength, your body, and your soul. Do you feel like the soul integrates the heart, mind, and body? Are they separate? How do you make sense of a verse like the Shema, the greatest commandment that Jesus teaches us?
Well, I haven't gotten to talk about that too much. Well, first of all, I think it's important to point out that in the Hebrew tradition, there was none of these false separations where you separate the parts and pieces of the self.
Yep.
The person was a unified whole. including the body, that you didn't parse like that, So I really ascribe to that. I feel like, yes, we are a unified whole, and that's what God intends for us to be, as a unified whole versus parts and pieces that we're addressing. I think that we are a body. We don't have a body. We are a body. And so I wouldn't even separate out. I think there's a false bifurcation there that can really be an obstacle to our spiritual growth when we separate things out that really do belong together in a unified whole. But I think there are different aspects of a person that verse is really helpful in the sense that, so the idea of your strength, your will, your intention, bringing your intention to something, that is a part of who we are, is that we can bring our will, we can bring our intention to something, and be very intentional about what we choose to do, with our lives. But I think formation in particular does do a beautiful job of bringing things together that have often been separated in ways that haven't been all that helpful.
Yeah, I love that language, the unified whole, and I think in such a compartmentalized and bifurcated reality, I think when you begin to see that, like you beautifully stated, the Hebrew had no understanding for that. It was just this connectedness to Echad, like to God as one. We are one, like how to live as one, and I think that's really, really, really profound. One of the pieces that I find is that a lot of leaders don't know how to tend their soul because they are on that treadmill. Sunday's coming, Sunday's coming, Tuesday's coming, leadership meetings, Thursday's coming, elder meetings. These people's maybe leaving the church. This person just died. We got, like, what would you say, just about how some preachers, pastors could begin that journey to tend to the soul?
Yeah. Well, the place that it started for me was with the practices of solitude and silence, which I distinguish from quiet times, because one of the things that I grew to learn was that my quiet times had been anything but quiet. That they were full of all sorts of human striving and human effort. Like, I'm reading through the Bible in a year. I'm got my prayer lists and my maps with the pins in it. And I've got my journal, and I've got my Christian self-help book, and I've got my Greek lexicon, and I got my commentaries. I mean, really, like, it was anything but quiet. It was just filled up with all of my own human striving and activity. And so when I entered into spiritual direction and my director started guiding me into solitude and silence, I realized what a different way of being with God that was. And one of the main differences was the fact that I was being receptive to what God had for me, letting God take initiative with me versus me coming in with this big fat agenda, and to rest with God, like solitude and silence became a place of resting in God, which resting with someone is very intimate if you think about it. To lay down with someone and rest with them is really intimate. You only do that with your spouse, your children, your grandchildren. I mean, only the most intimate relationships are ones where you can deeply rest. And so to experience solitude and silence as a place of rest for someone who had been so activistic up to that point was really amazing to me. It did something for my soul that nothing else had ever done. And then, the other thing was the quieting of the mind, because I think Protestantism, maybe even evangelical Protestantism, is very heady, very dogmatic, very, very much into our theologies and our systematic theologies, and we think really, really hard about everything. And so to be invited into a space where I could rest my mind and start to learn what it meant to rest my mind and just be present with the one who is always present with me, was a very different way of being with God. And so it certainly connected me with God in a more intimate way than I had experienced up to that point. And then it gave me a way of letting God take initiative with me versus me always being the one having the agenda. And then to experience God with my whole self versus just thinking about God was a really different kind of experience. Because I think a lot of my relationship with God up to that point had been very intellectual. I'd been thinking really hard about God, learning a lot about God. I love to study. And so, I would study, I would read, I would, do all the work of putting things into words. And you and I are both word persons. And so, to me, that was the beginning of really tending. There's a certain tenderness and gentleness in the practices of solitude and silence. Not that challenging things don't come to us in those times. They do. Eventually, we start to see very challenging realities about ourselves and the world around us. Sometimes God's invitations to us are very comforting, but sometimes they're very challenging. It's like, you want me to do what? I can't possibly do that. What? But it's much more of a fully orbed kind of relationship where I stopped talking for a while and I let God initiate with me. And so I would say still to this day, solitude and silence daily, extended retreat where I can go even deeper into the quiet and hear God's word to me, but also rest myself in God in a very intimate way and feel myself loved by God beyond all that I do for God. And then the practice of Sabbath, those are all the practices that are the most deeply connected with really not me tending to my own soul, but opening up space for God to attend to my soul, for God to do and to bring what I most need that I don't even know I need, you know?
Yeah. No, you have a great book on silence and solitude, and anyone, if you're like wanting to know just a little bit more about that, pick that book up. It's fantastic. When did that book come out?
That was the first one. And so I think it might've been 2004.
Okay.
It wasn't the first, but it was the first one on formation themes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay. I felt like I was like, maybe I got that 2008 or something on it, but I remember. And then I took a class with Jan Johnson in college, and she was teaching me about this. And I didn't know how to rest. And it wasn't until, getting to the desert and waking up early and going on these hikes, and there's nothing around. There's no cement. There's like coyotes that are moving, and I just would walk on this little home break trail that I would take, and I would just sit. And it was the first time, like what you just talked about, to quiet the mind and allow God to me, like to tend to me.
That's right.
And it was just that was what was transforming, and all, like, if you looked at it from the outside, it just looked like I was sitting down on a little bench, but I was just resting in the goodness and tasting and seeing how good God is. And it just, I felt like it knit me and put me back together, which was so kind of God. Yeah. Talk about the Transforming Center. I have friends who have gone and they've done this, for a year, and they just come out and they're just raving.
It's 27 months to be precise. 27 months.
Yes.
Yep. 9 retreats over 27 months.
9 retreats over 27 months. And
that's once a quarter.
Yep. So talk through that and why that length of time, and just the importance of retreating.
Yeah. Yes. Well, for the length, let's talk about the length first. When we began the Transforming Center, we've always had psychologists connected with us, and we had a psychologist who was part of the founding group of us that founded the Transforming Center. And I know where the 27 months came from. It came from him saying that from a psychological point of view, real change takes about 3 years. And so we're like, well, I don't know if we can get people to come for 3 years, but maybe we can get them to come for 2. So we first made the whole experience to be, 8 quarterly retreats over 2 years. But then we had Bob Mulholland, New Testament theologian, come and do an alumni retreat. And he talked about for the sake of others. And we're like, okay, well, everybody has to have that. So we're going to make it 9. So that's really what it was. It had to do with understanding the length of time that it takes for human beings to really change.
Wow.
And to incorporate new habits and to really establish new habits in your life and to experience new patterns that actually are transformative, where you're a different person. And so at the beginning, we didn't think anybody would ever join us for that long, but now people are just so sad when it's over, because it feels like forever when you look out at it from the beginning, but then when you look back on it, you're like, wow, that went so fast. Yeah. And it's a brick on brick approach to our formation as leaders. And so we build it one brick at a time, as opposed to come teach us about spiritual formation in a weekend. And the reason for the quarterly rhythm is that retreat is such an important practice. It's really straight from Jesus' invitation to the disciples, come away with me and rest a while. And I also feel like the quarterly rhythm is really important for leaders because even no matter how far you're getting into your dangerous levels of exhaustion, if you've got that quarterly retreat coming, you won't get too far into it before you have that. on your calendar. And, a lot of people will finish up with us and then they'll say, oh, I'm going to just go make a rhythm of quarterly retreats for myself. But very few of them are actually able to do it. There's something about having a group that's expecting you and where everything is prepared for you, and you have your own room and it's tech free, and you have a little community to be a part of that is holding you in that space and in that pattern and in that rhythm. That those parts of it become really, really important. So that quarterly rhythm then is one that people establish in their lives. So for a leader in particular, no matter how far out you've gotten into your dangerous levels of exhaustion, at least you've got this quarterly retreat always on the way, always coming. And you can almost find yourself crawling to it, like, yes. I know I can make it. I have a retreat out there, So there's that external rhythm of retreat, but then there's also an internal rhythm within each retreat where when people first get there, we ask them to take their leadership hats off for the first 24 hours till the second night. And so that time, there's the great silence. When we finish up night prayer, people go into the great silence. We don't speak again until morning prayer. Then we do have teachings in the mornings, but then the whole afternoon, 4 hours, is also spent in solitude. And so that's the deep time to really focus and give God space to attend to you. But then in the evening, we practice group spiritual direction as our way of being together in groups. And so there's the communal aspect there. There is the larger community, but there's also this small group of 5 that you take the whole journey with, and you practice group spiritual direction. And then somewhere along the way on the last morning, we start talking about leadership implications. So within any of the practices we talk about, it's personal, communal, leadership application. And so there's an internal rhythm too that people really get used to. Like it's almost, and once you come on to the campus, you begin to let go of your leadership responsibilities and settle into that place of just being a soul in God's presence. That's how we like to talk about it, is being a soul in God's presence for the first 24 hours. And then we can start experiencing some things, with people through group spiritual direction, and then start looking at, what is God calling me to as I go back, as it has to do with my leadership environment.
Well, I think this is what I think really separates you. And this is something I've always appreciated from afar, is the way you just broke that down, the personal, the communal, and then the leadership, right? I feel like I know incredible people, but they focus on one of those 3. And then oftentimes formation in many ways feels disconnected from leadership.
Yes.
And so we don't necessarily always know how to integrate what we're learning back in our actual real life or real pastoral roles or jobs and families.
Yes.
And I think what I've so appreciated, whether through your writing or through kind of stories that people have told me about what happens at that retreat, is just how you bring those two together, because I feel like, again, they've been bifurcated.
Yes.
The personal soul's formation and leadership. And I really believe the world needs to see really well-tended souls who are actually safe and consistent leaders and trustworthy leaders.
Yeah.
And I feel like sometimes we have really formed, healthy people, but they're not in leadership roles.
That's right.
And we have people who aren't tending to their souls in leadership roles.
That's right.
And so I think just even that name, the Transforming Center, I think what you're doing is really, really important, really, really beautiful. Why do you think we've bifurcated it so much?
I think that just seems to be what human beings do. It's one of the ways that our brains try to organize life.
Gotcha.
Is to put things in categories and then to elevate one over the other. And so we've got these two things that feel like polarities, that we manage that by elevating one over the other, and then we diminish the other one. And then we experience them as being profoundly separate versus things that it can be integrated synergistically. It's just something our brains seem to be wired to do. I also think, though, like Greek thought did that. Like, so we talked about the Hebraic thought where they didn't kind of parse the human person. But Greek thought was where that first started to happen. And I wonder if we've inherited that, as well. This tendency to create dualisms or bifurcations and then to elevate one or the other. And so it's not part of the Judeo it's not part of the Jewish tradition, but it's very much a part of the Catholic tradition and the Protestant tradition to create these false dualisms. And so whenever you bring things that belong together, it's really powerful, you know?
Yeah.
People who have lived them very separately. And, one of the ways we could talk about this is like, so if you're part of a church or a Christian ministry or something like that, you're on the board, you're on the staff, and you're privately and personally cultivating your own soul. But then when people come into a leadership environment, they come into a boardroom or something like that, they leave their souls outside the door, because they know that what's expected of them there is their strategic thinking, their intellectualizing, their ability to get stuff done. And so you've got people, even that action right there, leaving my soul outside the door while I come in to do this business meeting, even that, is part of the bifurcation. Because what we're saying is we don't need that part of you. Leave that part out there. We're wanting you to bring in whatever you got from leading a Fortune 500 company, or, your intellect, whatever, theology that you've learned in seminary. Bring that. We want that, but leave your soul outside the door.
Well, in full circle, like what you just shared 25 minutes ago, the soul is the purest form of you. Mm-hmm. So like, what are we actually saying? Like, hey, what God intended and created, we don't need that. We're going to put that over here. Mm-hmm. And instead of having that more integrated into how we make decisions and how we make choices and how we actually lead and shepherd. And that's I think another, just again, from afar, just as a fan and someone who's been really, really blessed by your work, is your ability to talk about the gift of discernment. Mm-hmm. And again, sometimes I don't think I knew how often I was leaving my soul outside the rim. Mm-hmm. I couldn't have discerned that. I thought the strategic thinking, I was bringing it, the achieving. I thought I was doing it, right? Yes. but I think it's starting to listen and learn and hear or just remember listening to a podcast that you did on discernment, and I just was like, nobody's talking about this in my circle, and nobody. If more leaders had that gift of discernment, they would probably not say as much as they do sometimes. They wouldn't lead in the way that they do. It would be healthier. Talk about discernment, because I think that is a core message of yours, just from the outside.
Yeah, it is. And that came from doing my training as a spiritual director. And I that's when I was on staff at Willow. I was doing my training then. And because I'm wired for leadership, I loved what I was learning for personal one-on-one spiritual direction. But I thought, man, this stuff really does and should apply to our life together in church. Somebody's got to write about that. And, I thought somebody else would, and wrote a few other books before I wrote one on that, because I just think it is, to me, the heart of spiritual leadership is the ability to discern the will of God, and also to guide others, to guide groups in the process of discerning God's will, versus just thinking things up, or doing the strategic thinking and planning, or being driven by ego or the loudest voice in the room. And even the idea of vision, which is really important, but sometimes it really is just a cover for our own ego-driven ideas. And that's pretty scary, because the scriptures are so clear about the fact that the wisdom of God is often the foolishness of this world. And in fact, in 1 Corinthians 2, Paul talks about the fact that it was the wisdom of this world that crucified Christ. So that's pretty sobering, is that all we're relying on is our human wisdom. Chances are we might even be working against God's purposes. It's very, very sobering. One of the questions I ask when I teach on corporate leadership discernment is, if we're not doing the will of God, if we're not seeking to discern the will of God in fairly intentional ways, what are we doing?
Wow.
And the room blows up.
Yeah.
Because everybody knows, we're following our own ego-driven plans. We're just trying to be culturally relevant and following the culture. We're just following the loudest voice in the room. It's scary when you open up that question, then where the decision-making is coming from. If we don't and my emphasis in that question is on fairly intentional ways. Like, of course, any Christian leader would like to be able to say, I and we are committed to discerning God's will. I mean, that's a basic of Christian living. But they don't have any ways that they do it. They don't have any practices that actually help them to do it. And so in that void, then we just make decisions in the same old ways, and in very secular ways. And what I mean by the word secular when I use it is not to be diminishing at all of secular wisdom. But when I say secular, I mean there's no space for God in the process. That's all I mean.
Yeah.
It could even be a bunch of Christians that are functioning in a secular way because they're not creating space for God. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
That's all I mean. I'm not saying that there's not wisdom to be found in, reading Lee Iacocca and people like that. But where's the space for God? Where's the space for prayer? Where's the space for self-examination? Where's the space for opening up to see what the Spirit might be doing? There has to be space for that, or else it is by definition secular.
Yeah. Well, and I think you're spot on. How many times have we been in message prep and we're just doing our thing? I gotta get this thing done. I gotta produce it. I gotta get my slides in. And in the last 15 minutes, hey God, will you bless this teach?
Yeah.
It's where was the listening? Where was just just really sitting with and discerning, is this where God wants me to take this message or not?
That's right.
Talk about when you use the word discernment. How would you define it?
Okay. Well, first of all, I will give you Ignatius's definition, which is really simple and beautiful. Finding God in all things in order that we might love and serve God in all. I mean, that's about alignment. It's just so pithy. I just love that.
Yes, beautiful.
Yeah. My own definition has a few more words to it because each one of the words matters. So I define it as an increasing capacity to recognize and respond to the presence and the activity of God, both in the ordinary moments of our lives and in the larger decisions of our lives. And let me just unpack a few of the words there. Yeah. So increasing capacity. Nobody's perfect at this. We cannot be perfect at discerning God's will while on this side of heaven, but we can increase our capacities. And it's really important for me to say that right off the bat. We have to be very humble about this thing called discernment. So there's practices that help us to increase our capacities, but we can't be perfect at it. Not because God's not speaking, but because we're fragile, Right. We're fragile human beings doing our best to hear the word of the Lord. So an increasing capacity to recognize and respond. And the difference there is that it's possible to recognize God and what God's saying, but to run the other way, like Jonah did. And so it's recognizing it, but then having our response be one of alignment. How can I align myself with what God's doing in this moment, with what I'm sensing about God's presence? And then presence and activity. I think the presence of God and discerning the presence of God is the habit of discernment, where we're increasing our awareness like the psalmist did in Psalm 139. Where can I go from your presence? When I go to the heavens, you are there. When I go to Sheol, you are there. That we can increase our awareness of God's presence with us each and every moment. We talk about that as consciousness, increasing our consciousness of God's presence. But then there are these moments when God's up to something, when it's activity, when you can say, something's stirring over there. Yeah. Like in Acts 15, where the Gentiles were starting to show signs of wanting to join the community of faith, and they were, speaking in tongues and things like that. There was this activity of the Spirit that was all stirred up. And so those leaders said, hey, God's doing something over there. We don't know what it is. We don't know what it means. We better stop and pay attention. So that's recognizing and then stopping when God's active. What's God doing? Again, so that I can align myself with that, so that I can get on board with what God's doing. So, God's presence is always there. We can get better at discerning his presence, but then there's activity, times when the Spirit is really stirring things up and we can stop and pay attention. So the presence and the activity of God, both in the ordinary moments, which speaks again of the habit, that when I'm driving my child home from school and they start to talk to me about something and I recognize, something really important is happening here. And it's like, God, help me to be responsive to you in this moment with my child. This really ordinary moment, I can discern God's activity and God's presence and God's guidance for a moment like that. And then the practice that goes along with moments when we're making big decisions, that there are actually practices that we can bring to bear. I'll say it one more time. So it's an increasing capacity to recognize and respond to the presence and the activity of God, both in the ordinary moments of our lives and in the larger decisions of our lives. Yes.
That book, Discerning
God's Will Together. Mm-hmm.
Pursuing God's Will Together. Sorry. That was 2015?
2012. Yeah.
2012. Okay. Mm-hmm. I read that in 2015,
Mm.
and it just helped me so much, like in the sense of, because I was kind of in this succession plan, and I was trying to discern, is this and just some of those practices, the questions and the ways that you worded stuff, I just was like, man, it just so rich. And I'm going to do this because I think it's, for many of you who have never read Ruth Haley Barton, you need to. We're going to do a giveaway on Instagram with 3 of the books, just because I want you to get your hands on these materials, because it is just, she's just special, just so special. You're getting a taste of it right now listening to her. I read this rabbinic tale about an interpretation midrash on Exodus 19. And where Moses goes up, he comes down, he goes up. And there's this beautiful passage that says, Moses spoke and the Lord answered him. But there's a footnote. And if you look at the very bottom of the Bible, it says, of that page, it says, the Lord answered him with thunder. And, you think about that, like AC/DC comes to mind, or something, thunder, or something like some loud noise. But the rabbis translate it as a thunder within. And that Moses was able to translate that thunder into 10 commandments, which is the next chapter. And I think there's something really, really beautiful, because I think as communicators, as leaders, sometimes we are starting to pay attention, and all of a sudden we can feel something, but where we rush and we don't know how to linger. We don't know how to translate that thunder. We don't know how to discern what God is actually doing. Talk about that, because I feel like the way that you have helped people be able to kind of discern that will of God, or discern like what God might be doing in that moment, discern and not stay on a schedule, but still have a schedule. Like you have this ability again of like formation, yet leadership, structure, yet it breeds freedom. Like it's you've been able to do this. And I think people struggle with this. Talk about how you discern when you have like a whisper or an inkling that you feel is the Lord. How do you see that through?
Well, I think that spiritual direction, and at least in the early stages of discernment, is really important, because spiritual directors can actually really help us to discern the spirits, not just out there, but in here. And I think that is one of the great challenges of discernment, is to be able to discern, the spirits inside myself. And just, good and evil is really how the New Testament talks about it. I talk about good as being that which leads us towards God, that which is from God, that which leads towards God's purposes. Evil being that which leads us away from God. It's not from God. It could actually be an obstacle to God's purposes. And we have to be able to discern that within ourselves first. Like discernment begins first with discerning the spirits inside ourselves, which I think is what you're describing, right?
Yep.
Yeah. Yep. And so in Ignatius's way of writing about this in his exercises, he talks about consolation and desolation. And so I think that's one of the key inner dynamics that we learn to pay attention to in discernment. It's very kind of antiquated language, and yet I don't want to change the language, because it's very nuanced and it's rooted in our own church history. So consolation would be that sense of what is drawing me towards God, what is drawing me towards life, what is drawing me into a sense of peace, what is helping me sense that I can show up in love and be my most authentic self in love. Those are all sort of biblical ideas around this idea of consolation. And you can pay attention to those. Like you can actually pay attention. Will this course of action lead me into greater peace, into a greater ability to be given over to God in love, or will it, lead me to bondage? Because where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. And then desolation would be the opposite, where I don't feel like I can be given over to God in love. I feel confused. God is not a God of confusion. So I feel confused or rebellious or something like that. And so I believe, and I think what the scriptures tell us is that we're being given the invitation by God himself to choose life, to choose that which gives us life. See, I've set before you life and death. Now choose life so that you and your descendants might live. And we can get better and better at attending to consolation and desolation. We might need help in the beginning. We all do need help in the beginning. Having a spiritual director where you can put this stuff out there and they can ask you really good questions about that. And so this is something that we develop a capacity for over time. It takes practice to discern our own inner spirits.
Yeah. Well, it's amazing. Like you quoted Deuteronomy, 30. It's one of my favorite passages. Right before that section that you quoted, it says, you don't need to climb the mountain.
That's right.
You don't need to cross the river. That truth is within you.
That's right.
And I think we don't often trust that or make the space to discern those spirits and really trust that consolation of where the healthy goodness of God is leading. And and I think
I don't even think that many of us as Christians believe that God is inviting us to choose life.
Wow.
Don't you? I mean, it's like, well, the thing that's going to be the hardest, that's going to be the thing that God's going to want me to do. Or, if I trust myself to God, God's going to take away the thing that I want the most. I don't even think that many of us as Christians believe that God is inviting us, not just inviting us, but in that passage, it's a command.
It's a command.
It's clearly a command. See, I set before you life and death. Now choose life.
Yes.
But I don't know if we as leaders really believe that. I think that we feel like we're called to lay down everything and kill ourselves in God's service versus, get to choose life. There's some real paradigm shifting that's going to have to happen. I love that part of the scripture that you're mentioning there. It says, it's in your mouth and it's in your heart for you to observe. That it's a very visceral thing. It's in the body. You talked about the body early in our time together here. That it's almost like God is saying, I've given you your body actually as a tool for discernment. Like I experience it almost like a tuning fork, that our bodies can be almost like a tuning fork for the divine presence and activity. So if we can learn to trust our bodies in that way, they become a real ally for us in discernment, because that whole experience of consolation and desolation is experienced in the body. It's visceral.
Yeah. I feel like in the last year and a half, 2 years, one of the practices that I've done is just putting both my hands over my heart just to get more attuned to that.
Right.
What's happening here, and like slowing it down. And it's been like just a simple way, but I think you're right. And I think when we discount what's happening in our body, it's really hard to discern the spirits that are
we've really cut off one of the main ways that God wants to communicate with us.
Right. Ruth, I'm like, there's so many questions I want to ask you, but I want to be respectful of time. And the Transforming Center, do you go into this in that 27-month cohort? Do you help people? Is that one of the bricks that you build?
Yes, we have a whole retreat on discernment. Yes. And so the first part of the retreat focuses on personal discernment, because that's the best preparation for corporate discernment or communal discernment. But then we do finish off with a session on corporate leadership discernment, which is what Pursuing God's Will Together is all about. Because, discernment is a very multi-layered thing in Scripture. It's a gift, yes, but it's also a mark of Christian maturity. Romans 12:2 just names it. He wasn't talking to anybody special. Paul was just saying, do not be conformed to this world, be transformed so that you can discern what is the will of God. So it's a mark of Christian maturity. It's just what we learn to do as Christians. It's important. And then there are some who are gifted at it, and we let them teach us, because I think sometimes we think, well, if I'm not gifted at it, I don't have to do it. But that's not the case.
Right.
That is not the case. What it means is that there's people who are especially gifted and you can let them teach you.
Yes.
Then it's a habit where we learn to recognize God everywhere, especially where we least expect to see him. Then it's a practice when we have a personal decision to make, that there's practices we can bring to a personal decision. And then finally, it is a corporate practice for leaders together. And that leaders can increase their own capacity. And then there are practices that you can put in place in leadership groups so that you can discern and do God's will together and guide your community in discerning God's will together. So discernment's a very big topic, and we take a whole retreat on it. Yeah. And it's after the body retreat.
Is that
so that we have a whole retreat on the body. And so we've already been cultivating respect for the body. So that it goes, there's the fifth retreat is about the body. You're getting comfortable with that. Then the sixth retreat is self-examination, so that you're already starting to discern the spirits within you and what's really driving you, right? And then the seventh retreat is on discernment. So that's one example of the brick on brick way that we do it.
Oh, I love that. That's amazing. And where can people go? Is it Transforming Center?
TransformingCenter.org.
.org. Yes.
.org.
Please go and check that out. And I also think that you have this really, really unique gift to synthesize really complex spiritual matters. I mean, just the way that you did that with your definition on discernment, or just even those 5, it's a gift. Mm-hmm. It is, a sign of maturity. The way that you do that gives us handles, and it's like such an amazing gift of that just really blends what's happening inside you, but a leadership way to pass that on. So thank you.
Well, it makes me laugh because we both know and love John Ortberg, and he would talk about how to getting the hay down where the goats can get it.
Yes, that's right. That's right.
What it is. We're all goats. We all need somebody to get the hay down where we can get at it. So I hope that is what we do. It's what I try to do.
That is amazing. You do that exceptionally well in your writing, and I really, really appreciate you. TransformingCenter.org. Anywhere else people can find you?
Well, my publisher is InterVarsity Press, and so all the books would be there. But we have, you can find books on the books on our site as well. And I have an author website, but the Transforming Center is the best place to go, or you can go to RuthHaleyBarton.com.
Awesome. Well, Hey, thank you so much for just your wisdom. And friends, please, you can go to Amazon, just scroll. Read the descriptions of her work. I'm telling you, I've read the majority of her books. They are absolutely must-reads, must-haves. And I don't just say that, I mean that deeply. And check out the transformingcenter.org, please. And if there's ever any way I can serve you, never hesitate to reach out, steve@steveryancarter.com. I hope you have a blessed weekend, and maybe something from this podcast about discerning those internal spirits. Maybe just even learning a little bit of tending to the soul, or finding some solace in solitude, and silence. Maybe there's something there for you. Choose something and then put it into practice this week. And then, until then, much love, grace, and peace, and we'll see you again.